That, ladies and gentlemen, we will get starting right away. The next session is about, will be on time, so we need to carry on. On behalf of UNESCO, the lead convener and the only convener of this session today, I would like to welcome all of you, those that are with us in the room, but also those that are following us from different countries. This session is on a regional executive dialogue on water in Indices, ways to enhance water components in climate policy and practice, with a focus, of course, on Indices. I will call Dr. Imam Bisher, Dr. Imam Bisher from the Regional Office of UNESCO in Cairo. Dr. Bisher is actually an interim leader of the regional center, is an experienced water expert in US and in the Arab region. He has been working on different aspects of water resources in the region, governance, groundwater, capacity development in water nexus. Welcome to Dr. Bisher. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hammo. It means a lot when a colleague like Hammo says, I have some experience in water. Thank you for the good testimonial. Colleagues and distinguished guests, I would like to welcome you to this particular session in the Cairo Water Week. Our session will discuss how can we waterize or introduce more of the concerns we have about water into the national determined contribution of member states in compliance with the Paris Agreement. Now, this idea and what we'd like to do eventually is to develop some modules, training modules, that will address different sectors in order for these sectors to account for water and for the impact of climate change on water in their plans for adaptation and mitigation. Water is very ubiquitous. It's in every sector we have, and within the climate change adaptation plan or the mitigation plans. And the idea, in fact, was not just an idea that came to our discussion with colleagues only, but it's been a result of work that UNESCO has had the privilege of working with ESCWA, with the League of Arab States, and with the UNEP program for the past few years, where we have been conducting training workshops for climate change, Arab climate change negotiators in the preparation for each and every COP, Conference of Parties and Negotiation on Climate. And UNESCO carried the mantle for water during these training or during these workshops. So we kind of began to emphasize the need to consider water in the climate change agenda, in the climate change negotiation, and how to do that. And many know that in many cases when you bring up the issue of water, they say it is more of an issue of development than an issue of climate change adaptation and all of these issues. So there is a lot of challenges. And then when the member states start putting their NDCs, determined contribution plans, to present to within compliance with the Paris Accord, it was very easily noticed, and that thanks to an analysis conducted by our colleagues in ESCWA, that found almost all Arab member states have water in their NDC plans. And to have water in the NDC plans means that you have to go back when you are implementing and you are achieving the contributions that you have promised within the Paris Agreement. You have to have a solid integration of all sectors related to water in order to achieve these things. So the idea came in to put together a training material and to present some toolkits for member states, for colleagues in different sectors who are supposed to support their government especially the sector related to water, in putting and updating and reporting on the NDC. And this what will be discussed. We thought before we really get into putting the material is to have in public discuss the issue, have a high-level discussion with our distinguished guest here so that we can tell them what we want to do, tell you also what we want to do, and then get a feedback so all of these feedback information can get at least in the first draft of our material, which then will be tested with a training and then finalized as we would like to do. I don't want to take too much of your time because I know that the time is short and we have distinguished guests who will really enlighten us with respect to what we want to do. I would like to give the floor to my dear colleague, Dr. Hammal Amrani, to take the lead from this moment on in this particular session.
Dr. Bisha, for this opening statement. I will be providing a snapshot. Can I have the first presentation? Yeah, this is the outline of the snapshot. I will try to present briefly to save a few minutes because we are 12 minutes behind schedule. Next, please. So the purpose and the context is an introduction I will be making, and then the climate change and the reason data of this regional dialogue. Why do we need as a region to be committed, engaged, and active in updating our NDCs and in making our climate policies sensitive to the water issues. And then I will look through quickly on to the NDCs in the Arab region. Actually, the challenge in looking into NDCs that 5 of them have come over the last 3 weeks as updated NDCs. So some of the facts that I will be reporting on might need to be revised accordingly. Then I will conclude on some suggestions for ways to enhance water in NDCs in the region. Next, please. So the purpose of this process actually is a kind of recurrent event. It's not going to be a one-shot event like this one, but rather debates on thematic issues related to water in NDCs. The purpose is to build a preliminary knowledge base for water in climate policy with a focus on water in adaptation, and I will come to the reason why water in adaptation and not water in adaptation and mitigation. The purpose is also to foster exchange between countries in the region, the differential levels of development and also of implementation of NDCs in the region. So it's hard to think about a regional perspective on NDCs. It's rather a country-specific standpoint. We also think of this series of dialogues as a way to strengthen the capacities for climate-proof water policies and climate negotiations capacities. Next, please. So the context is we are a global hotspot of unsustainable water use. We are not doing good in terms of reusing treated wastewater, for instance, as a growing resource. And the region has the greatest expected economic losses from climate change. We're likely to lose between 6 and 14% of our GDP by 2050. And of course, the water productivity in the region is about half of the world average. Next, please. So the subsidies in the water sector are also an issue that we need to consider while planning for adaptation and also for mitigation, by the way. And the extreme weather events are likely to be increasing over time, and the harm will be affecting the poor disproportionately. So more than 2/3 of our waters are coming from upstream countries in the shared basins. Next, please. So despite these gloomy figures, there are hopes and bright spots happening in the region. The new policies are taking place and enforced in the region. I'm mentioning some examples here. In Morocco, regarding the groundwater management, one of the big issues in the region. And Jordan's effort to harness private sector is also something that is new and that is actually have been a demand for a long time. Saudi Arabia is performing reforms for untargeted subsidies and revisions of tariffs. So all those, and Egypt's renewed focus on strengthening local accountability for water supply. I mean, all those are examples that something new is happening in the region, and we need to support it, and we need to make use of it in formulating and revising our NDCs. Next, please. So I think if climate change is a challenge, it's also an opportunity for us to accelerate those positive innovations that are taking place and multiply them across the region. Next, please. So in terms of knowledge and evidence that climate change will be affecting the region hardly compared to the rest of the world, and all recent reports are stressing that fact and that evidence. RICAR, which is an UNESCO initiative that has been working for years on assessing the impact and also in looking into adaptation in different sectors, has provided sufficient information on vulnerabilities to climate change and what needs to be done and what needs to be considered. And we hope that the indices, in the process of elaborating indices, should consider this kind of evidence, and those are regional data on vulnerabilities of the water sector, and it's also providing sectoral perspectives on agriculture, urban and cities, health. I mean, it's a comprehensive assessment of the impact of climate change. The global reports are also stressing that we will be hit hard, and that's why the indices need to take into consideration that it is not a joke. This is something that is very likely to happen, and we need to get prepared to it. So the indices should respond to the magnitude of the challenge. Next, please. So what are in indices? There are a few commonalities that I would like to first share. Looking through the indices submitted and those revised, it's not a homogeneous set of indices. So it's country-specific, as we have in the region low-developed countries, and we have the GCC countries, and we have the rest of the region. And also we have the difference in capacities in developing those indices. And some are just progressive and are very elaborated in terms of plans for implementation. But many are just generic direction providing documents rather than pledges with clear implementation mechanisms. So this is one common element to many countries. Another element that we'll be discussing with Carol at the end of this session is that countries that have elaborated advanced NDCs are countries that are benefiting from support from international cooperation organizations. And so the issue of capacities in indices, and that's why I'm really thankful to UNESCO for taking this initiative. We have a capacity issue. I know that UNFCCC is doing a lot, but there are gaps in capacity development, in indices development in the region. The second element is that Arab countries are very clear on that, and they are almost unanimous on the adaptation is the priority. I mean, though many countries are doing well in terms of mitigation, and I'm mentioning one single case, the example of Morocco, that is one of the very few worldwide that are ranked Paris Agreement compatible countries, with some reserve on that too. So we have countries that are investing in mitigation, but the priority for the whole region is clear, and I'm sure my colleague Dr. Mahmoud will come back to that. The Arab negotiators group are putting adaptation as a priority. So NDCs are mostly about adaptation, though they are supposed to be setting targets for GHG emissions reduction. And all trackers across the world are referring to the Arab countries in general, that they are not doing enough in terms of their pledges, but this is something that is subject to discussion. The third element is that the revised indices in many Arab countries last year and this year, and some of them are, as I mentioned in the beginning, are just coming 3-4 weeks ago. And we will hear some of the countries today talking about their experience. So very little is done in terms of increasing targets. Again, I will refer to Morocco and Jordan as two countries that have shown, and I think Egypt also has more ambitious in this year. My colleague, Dr. Samir, will be elaborating on that. Next. So maybe I will tell you next once I start this one, so that we will be saving some minutes. So, I mean, why indices are important for our debates in the region? Because they are an opportunity actually to unveil co-benefits for mitigation. Though we are adaptation, the adaptation is our priority, but there are adaptation with mitigation benefits where we should invest in the region. Next, please. So looking into the indices, most indices or most countries are aligning their national development plans where their indices, or at least it's referred in the narrative that there is an alignment between the indices and the national plans. And there are development of national adaptation plans, which means translating these indices into programs. And most of them are referring to the inclusiveness and participation of public, different sectors, different actors into development of indices themselves. And of course, there are clear and specific mentions to what are policy statements or plans. The most progressive one is Jordan and Lebanon, and of course, to a lesser extent, Egypt and Tunisia. Of course, the intention of countries is expressed clearly that they will be preparing water plans. Next, please. So if we think of the priority sectors for adaptation actions in indices, water is coming high, is ranking very well, and agriculture, ecosystems, energy, disaster risk reduction, food security, coastal protection zones, and a few are referring to fishery, example of Sudan. The key climate hazards identified are floods and droughts. That's a common thread to the indices, and as you see, the hazards are ranked either directly related to water or indirectly related to water. Next, please. So the dilemma in the indices, and that's also frequent but not general, that there are more actions and plans on infrastructure, but fewer on institutions. And as we all know, water in the region is not only a matter of infrastructure, it's also a matter of institutions, including data production and sharing, cost recovery, regulation and standards. In terms of infrastructures, there are plans for new infrastructure, but there are also plans for infrastructure production. General water management, we are not yet doing enough in terms of adopting and implementing IWRM, and it's explicitly referred to in 3 cases. Urban and wastewater management, treatment and reuse is also recurrent in the majority of the indices that are referring to water in adaptation. Disaster risk reduction, the kind of action is developing new early warning systems and flood and drought, for drought and flood control. And of course, water in irrigation. So those are kind of institutional and infrastructure investment that are planned for within the implementation of the NDCs. Next, please. So in terms of the percentage of each of those components in the total of countries by income, low income, middle income, and high income, we can see that institutions are almost all the same. So it's a shared challenge for all countries. But of course, the investment in water resources management is also differential according to the income. And that's probably a dimension that we need to consider when in our debate on implementing IWRM. Next, please. I will skip this one, as I'm running out of time. So pathways to enhance water in NDCs in the region. More and more IWRM implementation is needed. We need to prioritize adaptation with mitigation plans in order to be eligible to access climate finance and develop water bankable projects, of course. We need to do more in terms of aligning climate and water policies with other development policies. And I'm sure that Dr. Carol will come back to the necessity in the region to put together Paris Agreement, NDCs, and SDGs in the same package of plans and strategies. Develop the capacities to make water projects bankable under climate finance, and more coordination at the regional level to better negotiating position of the Arab group as a need. We already have a strong group, and we need to continue the capacitating process of this group. I will stop here for the sake of time saving. 3 messages. We are developing a wealth of evidence on what we need to do in water sector to adapt to climate change and to contribute to mitigation. So what is the leverage point for change to happen? 1, renewable energy is gaining ground in water supply, water treatment, and desal. And this is going to happen faster in the coming years. So link water to energy in NDCs is a way to do adaptation with the mitigation benefits, because the issue in NDCs is the implementation. And for implementation to happen, there are 2 sources: the public investment, of course, but the international climate finance that is not sufficiently flowing into the region. And the reason is that water projects are development projects. They are not climate change projects. So the incremental change that is climate related needs to be stronger in our implementation plans and national action plans in particularly. So for that to happen, we need a new generation of expertise that is aware of this condition for bankability and financial sustainability of the project. Finally, we believe that the big challenge is to have strong institutions, and in order to have strong institutions, we need to have strong individuals within the institutions. My conclusion would be, we have done a lot in capacity development. We need to do more, and we need to do a new generation of capacity development that takes into consideration what is needed for NDCs to move from good documents to functioning programs across the region. I will stop here, and I will ask you if you have 1 to 2 questions for me. Otherwise, I will hand over to my colleagues in the panel that is going to be almost 90% speaking from abroad. So if there are questions, clarifications, or I will just take this as an indicator of my clarity while exposing the presentation.
We can have a discussion afterward.
Or we move the discussion to later after the panels. Well, that's a way to save a few minutes. With no due delay, I will now ask Dr. Walid Zubari from the Arabian Gulf University in Bahrain. Walid Zubari is a professor at the university, and he's the head of the Water Resources Department. He's a Nexus champion across the region. He is contributing tremendously to capacity development efforts by different organizations here with us on groundwater, on modeling, but also on promoting Nexus across the region. Walid, if you can hear me, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Dr.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me in this very important session and providing me with the opportunity to present some of the work that we have done in the NDCs and at the level of the GCC. I think, I put the title as some thoughts. This is not really structured presentation. It's just like some thoughts that has come within the time limit that has been given and the purpose of this discussion. I think to answer. To address the question of the NDCs in the water sector and what can be how to accelerate that and what is needed to do that is, I think we have to have some a kind of deep dive into the water energy nexus in the region, which is very strong in the GCC countries because it depends on desalination, which is depending on fossil fuel, which is emitting the greenhouse gas emissions. As all of you know that GCC are almost devoid of surface water, and they have very limited conventional water resources, and they are at the same time they are rapidly developing and having a very fast population growth, rapid population growth, and this is of course associated with demand for water and groundwater or whatever the natural water resources available can't fulfill that, and they have to rely on non-conventional water resources, which is mainly desalination and treated wastewater. This is just the context that we are dealing with. We have a very, very rapid municipal water demands because of population growth and very fast urbanization. And the GCC countries have to go very fast in developing their desalination plants. Currently, you have almost all the water supplied in the GCC for the municipal sector is relying on desalination plants. Of course, that takes us to the heart of the crux of the matter, which is because of this water scarcity, our energy intensity is very high. And because we are using this fossil fuel and running our desalination plants or water supply system, that of course it will increase our energy intensity. So that's the issue that we are having, that we are using thermal or we are using desalination, which is the majority of is thermal. If you are having 1 cubic meter of water will consume something like 24 kilowatt hours, and that will probably produce for me something like 20 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And that's really a huge amount because of the of the technology that we are using or have been using, but there is also a shift, and because of the fuel type that we are using. Now, when we go and analyze what is happening in this municipal water sector, you will find that the culprit of greenhouse gases emissions is actually the water production. All the others are really nothing compared to the water production, which means our desalination plants. And if I want to lower my greenhouse gases emissions, I have to work on this area as much as I can. Now I can work on the technology of this, and this is actually happening. The thermal, many countries are moving from thermal to membrane to lower their emissions. That's one. The other thing is that they are trying to introduce renewables, although it is very, very slow, at a slow pace. There's a lot of technical issues to convert your desalination into a membrane, but they are actually moving to a membrane to allow for the renewables to be a source of electricity, because membrane, you need only the source of electricity, it's not co-production. The other issue is actually to really lower your demand. So you have to implement demand management and efficiency measures. And if you want to if there is any take-home message from my presentation, I would like to tell you that demand management and efficiency and conservation will be much, much less expensive than the other options, and it is more sustainable for the GCC countries. So this is the take-home message just before we, even before finishing my work. So that's when you go to the GCC countries, water-related indices, and I have tried to establish this matrix just recently. What's actually they are trying to do? Of course, they have the mitigation co-benefits where you can do something, but it has a co-benefit in mitigation. So it's not a climate action per se, but it is something that you do, but it has an impact on climate action. And we have also the adaptation, and we have also both adaptation and mitigation. We don't have to go into these details. I have summarized them in 4 points, and we have also the means of implementation has been, put in this matrix. So if you look at, if I would summarize all this, adaptation and mitigation benefits are actually the 4 areas that need to be looked at: less energy-intensive desalination technology and renewables, and municipal sector demand and efficiency, and reuse of treated wastewater. The last 2, okay, I will be trying to emphasize on and try to push our governments to look at it seriously. The means of implementation actually. Most of the countries are talking about technology transfer and capacity building, and some are calling for financial assistance, like Bahrain has called for financial assistance and has actually received a GCF fund of $2.16 million to build the capacity of its to build its institutional individual capacity in demand management to combat to adapt for climate change. So I would just like to show you this graph. In a graph, I just want to show you that I want to let you know that when we did the unified water strategy for the GCC, I have done a modeling for what would be, the savings that we can have if we just implement simple measures, reduce the per capita water consumption and reduce the leakage. And this matrix shows for each country how much water will be saved financially, and how much desalination requirement we will need, how much energy requirement for desalination, how much greenhouse gases emissions will be saving, and then how much generated wastewater will be saved, and how much treatment financial cost will be saved. If I look at this graph in this table into a graph, you'll find this is the business as usual, that the first line. And if I implement these 2 measures or management interventions in the demand management and in the efficiency, this is an efficiency, reducing distribution network is supply efficiency, reducing per capita is actually efficiency, water use efficiency, and demand management. And you will have this type of curve. Now, if you look at this area under the curve and analyze it, you will find that you will be having not only financial cost, but you will have a lot of greenhouse gases emissions reduction. And that's a huge amount that we can really save, and we can contribute to our country's commitments to the Paris 2015 agreement. So that's the main message that I'm trying to say. But to move from this curve to that curve, you will need to implement demand management and efficiency measures, which is until now in the GCC are not actually being implemented effectively. To move from here to there, you will need three policy instruments, as everybody knows. You need the economic policy instruments, which is the tariff and the incentives and disincentives. And the other thing is structural and operational, where you have retrofitting water-saving devices, metering, and so on, so on, so on. And the last thing is the socio-political, tools or instruments, where you can, education, training, awareness, and appliances labeling, and so on, so on. So these are the, this is my take on this. But I would like to go back to this curve. If I'm sitting in the GCC, and UNESCO would like to do some training, areas for me, I would love to have a capacity building in municipal water demand management efficiency and reuse of treated wastewater. These are the two very important issues for capacity building. That's my take, and I hope I am within the time limits.
Thank you, Dr. Walid, for sharing this reflections. GCC countries are kind of context and ecosystem that is different in terms of the natural realities. I can see that the echo is just going too high. Can we reduce the echo, please? So thank you, Walid, again. I'm not going to be summarizing the key points because they are too many in one hand, and in one hand we will have less time for the rest of the panelists if we expand on summarizing the very valid points that Walid has suggested. I will now move to the next speaker, Dr. Samir Tantawi from Egypt. Dr. Samir is a project manager and the project manager of the 4th National Communication in Egypt, UNDP Ministry of Environment, member of the Egyptian delegation to the UNFCCC COP since 2005, the lead reviewer with the UNFCCC for developing and developed countries climate change reports, and finally the lead author with the IPCC for the 2019 refinement of GHG guidelines. Dr. Samir, تفضل مشكورا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the beginning, I would like to thank the organizers, the UNESCO, my colleague Dr. Hammo, for the invitation. I will try to talk briefly on the national determined contributions reports and how the water-related topics have reflected in national reports, and highlight some ideas and challenges on watering climate in the national reports from the perspective of our national experience. In the beginning, I would like to highlight the very well-known IPCC recent report that my colleague Dr. Hammo already gave some insights about the outcomes of this very important report through the Working Group 1, which is the physical science base, as part of the upcoming IPCC 6 assessment report. The report in its summary for policymakers highlighted many important findings and facts. For example, the fact sheet for MENA region, our region, indicated a projected decrease in mean precipitation and increase in fire weather conditions, as well as decrease in mean wind speed. The report also stated an observed and projected increase in the aridity and droughts in our MENA region, Middle East and North Africa region. Next, please. To link between the recent IPCC reports and the climate change work on the national level, our national officials, together with our experts and consultants, identified vulnerability of Egypt to climate change adverse impacts, which among others, for example, the most important relevant issues, the sea level rise, particularly in the north coast area of the Nile Delta, flash floods in different areas in Egypt, heat waves and dust storms, which are common in Egypt, as we know, in addition to other vulnerabilities, but this is the most important vulnerabilities that we have identified. Next, please. Through many deliberations and consultations on the national level in different meetings and workshops and expert meetings, we have identified 8 climate risks to be considered in our future studies, including the vulnerability and adaptation chapter in the national communications, the 4th national communications that we are already developing during this time. The mentioned risks had prioritized based on expert judgment. As presented on the screen, the sea level rise comes priority, then temperature increase and heat waves, then heavy sudden precipitation and flash floods, and droughts, then freezing days and warm nights. For each climate risks, we are planning to go in-depth studies to analyze specific parameters which also identified by our national experts, including impacts and its regional extent, direct and indirect impacts, results, and sustainable development linkage and relevant stakeholders of each risk. Next, please. A preliminary climate risk assessment map has been developed that illustrate the 8 climate risks that I presented in the previous slide and the regional distribution of each risk along the area of Egypt. Next, please. Well, it's very well known and noticed by everyone the increase in number and frequency of national climate change reports requested by developed countries. The list here presented in the screen includes 7 different types of climate change reports or climate change related reports. And I identified up-to-date status of each report. In brief, for example, NDCs, the National Determined Contribution. Egypt has developed its first NDC and submitted to Paris COP in 2015. And currently, we are preparing an update for this NDC. The long-term strategies, we are currently developing the first ever climate change strategy, 2050, considering previous related strategies, policies, and plans. The strategy framework has already approved by the Climate Change National Council. And before this session, 2 days earlier, there was an event to present a short summary about the strategy. The strategy will be presented in COP26 in Glasgow next month. The LEDS, Low Emission Development Strategy. Egypt has developed the first ever LEDs in 2018, and now we are updating our LEDs together with developing the climate change strategy. NAPS, National Adaptation Plans. We have completed initial studies for NAPS, and a project will be started shortly to support the implementation of the full NAPS. For national communication and BOR, biennial update reports, we have submitted to the Secretariat of UNFCCC 3 national communication, and we are developing the 4th communication now, as well as 1 BOR report. NAMAs, which stands for Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions. We have conducted many studies in different sectors. It's a mitigation-related issue. So the mitigation issues or mitigation-related sectors have many studies, and we have developed a mitigation action database, including all the information we have got from these studies. And finally, TNA, which technology need assessment. So far, unfortunately, we have no technological need assessment report have prepared or submitted to the UN so far. Next, please. This is a collection of some national reports that I mentioned in the previous report, which submitted to the UNFCCC, and all of our national reports can be found on the UNFCCC website and can be downloaded. Next, please. Considering one of the strategic national documents, Egypt Vision 2030, we can find some programs and projects for economic development until 2030 related to water, and it's presented here in the slides. And for your information, the Egypt Vision 2030 is now under updating, and the updated version will be published soon, inshallah. Next, please. Under the same strategic document, Egypt Vision 2030, there is an environmental sector, includes some programs which are related to water sector. Next, please. Yes, next. In Egypt NDC 2015, there are also some intended actions to promote resilience. The presented actions here are under the adaptation section related to water, and as I said, we are now in the process of updating our NDC. Next, please. In 2011, Egypt has developed and approved the National Adaptation Strategy, which will be updated through the National Adaptation Plan, which I mentioned earlier. This strategy provides an assessment of vulnerability and list of mitigation measures, which covers many sectors or many important vulnerable sectors, as stated in the screen here. Next, please. In our first NDC report, we have presented preliminary estimation of the cost of adaptation measures based on expert judgment in 2015. And the numbers here, or the figures here, are a projection taken from the 2015. We can see that the cost of mitigation, according to our national expert judgment, is about $10 billion US in different sectors. Next, please. Well, as we all aware, there is a Green Climate Fund. This is a fund established to finance the climate-related projects, mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. We all know also that during Copenhagen COP in 2009, developed country parties have committed to mobilize $100 billion US every year to finance the climate change projects, which unfortunately not fulfilled so far. Some statistics from the Green Climate Fund website, as you may see here on the screen, shows that total number of approved projects is 100 90, almost 50-50 balance between mitigation and adaptation projects. The mitigation project or mitigation-related projects are expected to result in greenhouse gas emission reduction by about 2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. And the adaptation-related projects, the number of people with increased resilience is about 600 million. And the total finance of the mentioned number of projects is $10 billion, which is 10% of the committed finance by the developed countries to developing countries. But the good news is that in Green Climate Fund, in its recent meeting or last meeting in 7 October, approved the first CRAFT project, which is catalytic capital for first private investment fund for adaptation technologies in developing countries, with total investment $400 million, and the Green Climate Fund is sharing or contribute with 100 billion in this fund. Next, please. Also, we may note that Africa is among the lucky region with a number of approved projects, but most of them are projects with small funds. Maybe there is a focus on mitigation-related projects, and the high project fund goes to the mitigation. But there are some ideas of water-related projects that can contribute in greenhouse gases, and my colleague Dr. Walid and Dr. Hammo may give some examples in the previous presentations. For example, Dr. Walid mentioned the solar water or renewable energy water desalination, also the hydropower and effective irrigation system, the bioenergy, the biomass, and crop management and different others. This type of projects are adaptation projects with mitigation co-benefits. And there are many others, not only this. Next, please. This is my final slide. The challenges that we faced from the experience to enhance the water section in our national climate reports, particularly NDC. It's important to have a national climate change law. So far, we have no climate change law in Egypt. This law can assure or guarantee the exchange of updated data and information under strict MRV. MRV stands for Measuring, Reporting, and Verification System. Climate finance also is a crucial issue. It's important to have the climate change actions and measures to be considered in national planning and budget. It's important not to depend on the climate finance from outsource. It's important to include climate change in our planning, and actually the country already invests in different programs and projects that have climate change impacts, positive climate change impacts. Mainstreaming of climate change into different stakeholders enables strengthening, developing, and update climate policies and plans. And finally, as mentioned in previous presentation, it's essential to keep capacity building and capacity development and awareness of climate change on a different level. This is a short message that I would like to present to you, and thank you for your attention.
Short message, but a very solid one, actually. A lot of extremely progressive things are happening in this country. And thank you, Dr. Samir, for sharing all this information with us today. I will now move to the next speaker, Dr. Nidal Katbi Badr from Ramallah in Palestine. Dr. Engineer Nidal is just like Dr. Samir, very involved in the official components of what has happening over years now in the work with UNFCCC, and Palestine has just submitted its own revised NDC, and Dr. Engineer Nidal has been playing an instrumental role in developing this new NDC. Engineer Nidal is an advisor for climate change to the Minister of Environment in Palestine. He's also the national focal points of UNFCCC and the national focal points for IPCC from 2009 up to today. And he's the national designated entity, part of the designated entity for Climate Technology Center and Network from 2016 to now. I think this is just a summary of what, of how many things Engineer Nidal is involved in. A brief presentation on indices and water in Palestine. Mohandes Nidal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hammo, and thanks for the UNESCO for this invitation. And indeed, I'm currently traveling from Palestine, and currently I'm in Jordan, going tomorrow, inshallah, to Glasgow. So I'm trying to be very brief in my presentation, just to have some kind of signals on how our updated NDC is capturing the issue of water. Just to confirm, are you hearing me, and do you see my slides?
Yes, we can see them, Dr.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So the other, I'm trying to very briefly signal how our updated NDC captured the water in the Palestinian context in our NDC. As we all know well, that water sector in most countries, especially in our area, is the most and highly vulnerable sector that is really hit hard by the impact of climate change. And this impact of climate change on water sector is very much reflected and have severe implications on all other sectors. When we are talking about the agriculture, food security, energy, health, all other sectors are really very much impacted by the impact of climate change on water sector indeed. When we are talking about the climate change impact on Palestine, as Dr. Hammo mentioned earlier, in our region, Palestine especially, our main focus and our main priority is adaptation. The Palestinian emissions is really 0.1% out of the global emissions, so it is nothing. But we are also want to signal and to share the international community that we are sharing the burden and we're trying to be part of the solution for the climate change, although we know well that most of the emissions in our region really in general are very much slow. So our main and overriding priority is really adaptation to climate change. It is not mitigation, but we have mitigation efforts. And we have, as Samir was saying, we have a lot of mitigation co-benefits for our adaptation actions. So this really need to be captured. And we know well that this is one of the toughest issues under the negotiations, how to capture the mitigation co-benefits of adaptation actions. So in Palestine, we need to consider and we need to know well that the Israeli occupation really have very tough impact on our efforts to respond to climate change, whether in the adaptation side or on the mitigation side. And this is why we were unique in our communication report in our NDCs that we have two scenarios. The scenario one, or the main hypothesis, that we have full independent state of Palestine, that there's no occupation, that we have full control and free control for our resources, for our borders, for our land, water, and people as well. So this is our main hypothesis. The other one is the status quo. What we are facing now, that the Israeli occupation is now controlling everything in Palestine, stealing our natural resources, controlling the borders, controlling everything, security issues, development issues, economic issues. But although under even this kind of very tough conditions, we are able to do a lot of things. This is why we have two scenarios: the status quo, what can we do under these current conditions, and the main hypothesis if we have full independent Palestinian state. So this is why we have these two scenarios in our NDCs, national adaptation plans, and that was reflected also in the national communication report. So what we have here in water, what we did is really we were focusing on the 12 highest vulnerable sectors in the national adaptation plan. And just to remind you that Palestine was the 6th country in the world submitted the national adaptation plan to the UNFCCC on 11th of November 2016. Only less than 8 months from accessing the convention as a party, state party to the convention. That was because we started such kind of work and homework years before we came a party to the conventions. So in our national adaptation plan, we recognized 12 sectors as highly vulnerable to the impact of climate change. The first and the most impacted is the water sector. So what we did is also we reflected that sense to the NDC. When, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Hamo, about the links between adaptation and water, the main angle we are approaching water is really the adaptation side. This is why we are really very much looking for the adaptation part of the water, although we have a lot of mitigation benefits on the way. In Palestine and in the region, we know well that drought is really the most serious thing out of climate change, especially if we are looking also to the STRIX report, the special report of the IPCC on the extreme weather events. We know well that drought is the most really serious things in the region. This is out of question, and drought comes and very much related to the water scarcity or decrease of water resources as a result of climate change. And if you are looking to the different scenarios, and really I am really very much like to look to the worst scenarios, which is 8.5. And this is because this is what we are really observing on the world. We don't see really very much willingness to abide to the 1.5 or 2 degrees of Paris Agreement. What we are always seeing nowadays is only a result of 1.1 increase of the temperature. But we know well that Paris target is 2 degrees. So this means that we are expecting many folds of what we are seeing now, whether it comes from the extreme weather events, slow onset events, a drought, flash floods, or whatsoever. So really, we need to be really very much prepared to such kind of scenarios. We observed it. Science is telling us that what is coming is really very much serious, and we need to really be very much prepared. So in principle, we are talking about the extreme weather events, slow onset events, and how this may have serious impact on the water sector. We need also to consider the demand side, which may, with high temperature, we are expecting more demand for the limited available water resources, and this will really have very much impact on the groundwater quantity, and also on the different aspects of our daily lives, on the health, on the daily livings of the people, on the health impact on our daily lives, and our really in some social groups like the elderly or the children, or these people will be very much impacted by the impact of climate change, especially on the water sector. And just to remind you that in Gaza, almost most or all of the water resources are really incompatible to the WHO standards to the drinking water or the potable water. Almost more in some reports they are talking about that more than 97% is not really compatible with the WHO standards for the drinking water. So in general, all of these things at the end of the day will have really severe impact on the water quality, and this is including the impact of flash floods, when it hit in the season. So all these will have really very tough implications on our people and our ecosystems. So what we did in our NDC, updated NDC, indeed for the last almost 1.5 years, we were working with the support from the NDC partnership under the window which is called CAP support, Climate Action Enhancement Package, where we received some kind of fund and we were able to have some kind of technical assistance and experts on board who are trying to really assist our efforts and enhance our efforts to respond efficiently to the impact of climate change. So what we did is we did just recently and produced 14 detailed NDC implementation action plans. In these detailed action plans, we are really...
Dr. Nidal, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, so I thought I am too brief. So thank you for reminding me, Dr. Ham. Just to try to be more brief and more fast. So we were focusing on 3 main areas on the NDC action plans. First is the water treatment and conservation. The second is improving water networks and infrastructure. We know well in Palestine for tens of years, there's no really very much were done under occupation for the our network infrastructure. And the third one was really on the improving water source infrastructure, because really Israelis there were really not allowing the Palestinians to do whatever so on the area of water resources, because they were considering this as a security issue. Among that and out of that, what are the conditional NDCs action we are looking for? And to be really more focused and just direct and to have a very clear idea of what we are expecting under these actions. And I may stop here, that 70% of the treated wastewater in large-scale wastewater treatment plants in the West Bank and Gaza are reused by 2030. And now we have some kind of negotiations at the country level on a national program for wastewater collection, treatment, and reuse. And we have some kind of positive signals from some kind of international development partners. The other target that 7 million cubic meters of rainwater in the West Bank is harvested by 2032. And 2032, this is in alignment with the water national strategy. We were trying to align ourselves to the water strategies in the national strategy. The third one on non-revenue water is reduced by 15%. We know well, for many reasons, there are a lot of water which is not costed or not revenued, and we need to decrease this for 15% by 2032. 5% of rainwater in priority urban areas to be drained and collected and used by 2032. 100% of certain identified groundwater wells and springs to be rehabilitated by 2030. And the construction of Gaza desalination plant, which is almost costing $700 million, is really started implementation on the ground by 2025. We know well that there are on the ground a lot of things were done on the ground, and thanks for the many donors who really supporting this project. But this project needs still some kind of pledging for the rest of the money, and just to complete the total amount needed. And just to mention that all of these we touch upon, we prepared the technology roadmap in Palestine, where we tried to understand what kind of technologies we may need in these different areas. And the last slide only just a couple of indication on the cost of these action. And can I stop here, and thank you so much, Hammo and colleagues, and sorry for this long presentation. Thanks.
شكرا مهندس نضال. Very rich and interesting presentation and informative presentation indeed. We now move to the West and hear from Morocco, Moulay Idriss Hasnawi, who is also an NDC man with a water perspective. Moulay Idriss Hasnawi Vous avez la parole. It seems that we are not lucky enough to have Morocco with us today for probably a problem of connection. So that will bring us to listen from a distinguished panelists with us. We have the privilege of having Madame Carol Shani from ESCWA. She is the chair of the Arab Center for Climate Change Policy, and recently nominated, and my congratulations to Carol for the position of the head of the cluster Climate Change and Sustainable Development or Natural Resources Management at ESCWA. Dr. Carol, for those of you, he's there? Is joining? Right, so we hold on for a second to listen to Morocco. Si Hsnaoui كتسمعني? Si vous m'entendez, allez-y. 5 minutes. سيد الحسناوي هل تسمعني؟ So I think we can take him later, but let us now move to Carol. Has been working as a lead of the RICAR initiative.
Bonjour, vous m'entendez?
Oui, I think.
Je n'arrivais pas à activer le son ni la caméra tout à l'heure.
So there is a problem with the technology. Vous avez 5 minutes.
Il vient d'être débloqué. Oui, 5 minutes. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
There is a translation for those that need.
Je remercie tout d'abord les organisateurs pour m'avoir invité.
في ترجمة يعني.
Oui, j'espère qu'il y a la traduction du français en anglais en arabe.
يمكن لو ممكن تتكلم باللغة العربية وبعدين لخص أنا أهم النقاط يعني. تفضل.
بطبيعة الحال أشكر يعني المنظمين على الدعوة للمشاركة في أسبوع الماء الجمهورية المصرية. بطبيعة الحال كما تعرفون التغيرات المناخية بالمغرب عرف التغيرات المناخية يعني منذ السبعينات بدأ يعني التناقص في التساقطات المطرية وموارد المياه. إذا المغرب كان يعني وضع واحد استراتيجيات ثنائية بين الفلاحة والمياه بطبيعة الحال اللي بدات في 1967 بانطلاق يعني سياسة تشييد السدود لسقي 1,000,000 هكتار سنة 2000 اللي اعطاها الانطلاق يعني المرحوم صاحب الجلالة الحسن الثاني طيب الله ثراه في 67. إذن كانت سياسة ثنائية بين الفلاحة والمياه يعني بناء السدود الكبرى لسقي 1,000,000 هكتار. ثم يعني في سنة 2000 بطبيعة الحال كانت هناك استراتيجية وضعت استراتيجية يعني استراتيجيات 2020 في القطاع الفلاحي بطبيعة الحال، وكانت تزامنت يعني مع يعني إصدار قانون الماء سنة 1995. كذلك في 2008 كان يعني المخطط المغرب الأخضر، ومن بعده في 2009 كانت استراتيجية الوطنية للماء اللي اعطى انطلاقتها صاحب الجلالة محمد السادس بفاس 9 أبريل 2009. ثم كذلك تلتها يعني حاليا في 2020 تعطت الانطلاقة يعني الجيل الأخضر في الميدان الفلاحي. كذلك البرنامج 2020-2027 اللي هو مخطط استعجالي يعني لتنمية الموارد المائية وإيجاد الحلول للمشاكل المطروحة في التزويد بالماء الصالح للشرب خاصة بالعالم القروي، ثم إتمام السقي بالميدان الفلاحي. إذن هذه الاستراتيجيات بطبيعة الحال كانت كتجدد تقريبا كل 15 سنوات في المغرب، وكانت دائما استراتيجيات موازية بين القطاع الفلاحي والقطاع المائي. دابا إلا رجعت يعني لي زينديسي، يعني لي زينديسي المغرب، فتقريبا بالنسبه للماء يعني لي زينديسي تقريبا كان يعني هي ambitious بروجرام. عندنا يعني نتوخى يعني الربط بالماء الصالح للشرب 100%، ثم الربط بصرف يعني المياه بطبيعة الحال 90% في سنة يعني 2030. كذلك معالجة المياه العادمة نتوخى يعني الوصول 80% من المعالجة سنة 2030. كذلك بطبيعة الحال بالعالم القروي نتوخى يعني الربط بشبكات صرف المياه 50% بالعالم القروي، ثم يعني نسبة معالجة المياه العادمة 40% بطبيعة الحال. إعادة استعمال المياه بالنسبة يعني للعالم الحضري نتوخى يعني تقريبا إعادة استعمال 275 مليون متر مكعب سنة يعني
شكلنا عندنا مشكلة في التواصل مع السيد
بالعالم الحضري و16
للأسف يعني أن المداخلة توقفت بسبب ضعف الشبكة. كارول, sorry for giving a chance to Morocco to share with us the experience in developing their NDCs. From what you hear today from countries, the most detailed and most progressive NDCs in the region and in many countries in the region are developed with the support of bilateral and multilateral organizations. So based on ESCWA, RICAR.
Thank you, Hamo, and thank you for this opportunity. Very rich session today, and a lot of things to bounce ideas off of. And in response to your question, I think this links into the whole conversation here, but I wanted to start with a premise that I'd like maybe to argue with you about, is the idea that water is a development challenge. Everything is a development challenge. Sustainable energy transition is an energy challenge. Energy vulnerability in our region is a development challenge. But in our region, which is water scarce, climate change and water and adaptation are synonymous in terms of being in the same conversation. I think sometimes the donor community, perhaps, because they compartmentalize different ways of funding different projects in different ways, may inflect onto the region how they should also cost and propose projects. But even in the UN Water, and ESCWA is a UN regional commission that is part of a UN Water network, and that network has a water and climate change committee. And well before Paris, we were talking about adaptation is all about water. And there is no better example than in the Arab region. And yesterday even we had a whole series, a whole day of activities under the Water Action Decade, which talked about water challenges facing water scarce countries and water security facing water scarce countries, which is our region. So yes, it's a development. There's a lot of development challenges, but I would start with saying adaptation, water. We should not have a difficulty making that argument. Why we are having difficulty making that argument is twofold that were also raised today. The data issue, we need the proof, right? That this is not just a water story that is not related to climate, because we are an arid region. We are a water stressed region. So we have to find the amplification that climate might be contributing. But climate does not start tomorrow. Climate is not starting in the year 2030. Climate has been going on for the last century and a half as we've tracked it. And the work that you mentioned about RICAR, which I'm very pleased and honored that you continue to reference, the little snapshot here, that we did to conduct, to assess what climate change means for water-dependent countries, for water-dependent sectors in the Arab region, showed that just in comparison to the beginning of this century, forget the 1850s, what people talk about the IPCC and increasing 2 degrees Celsius, just from the beginning of this century, 20 years ago, the temperature in our region has increased by 1. Just by mid-century, we're talking by 3, and by end century, 3 to 4 degrees temperature average for the Arab region. So we can't talk about climate as a future. It is happening now, and we all have to be part of the solution. So using the data to help inform the conversation about water and what it means for the water cycle as temperatures increase, what it means when we think about arid crops and agriculture, ecosystems, biodiversity, et cetera. That is part of where the evidence comes in from regional climate modeling, from assessments, and from the various communications that the countries obviously are doing to already bring that into play. The other challenge here, and just because we have the League of Arab States obviously with us on both ends of the stage here, to also mention that the need to present that data should be in a way that is harmonized and understood. So sometimes, and I realize it's difficult for many countries who are working to do their nationally determined contributions, but climate change is a transboundary question, okay? There's not one country, it doesn't stop at the border of Libya and Egypt, that climate is going to change. So looking also at harmonized methodologies, harmonized ways of presenting information also reinforce the opportunity for justifying projects in country and also potentially between countries. I mean, we talk about intersectoral between water and agriculture, or water and energy, as Dr. Zubari mentioned before. There's cross-sectoral projects, but there are also regional projects, and that can be enhanced by the right data sets. Besides data, the other point I'd like to talk, which everyone always talks about, is the finance, the money. This is where, not only in our region, but globally for developing countries, we're having to face a challenge, because it's very easy to cost a solar system. It's easy to cost a wind farm. It's easy to cost mitigation projects per se. Okay, maybe not for livestock and methane, but generally it's understood the costs. It's not so easy to cost adaptation projects. And that is understandably what is challenging all the countries when they're preparing their NDCs, where water, and I think we've counted as of last week, 13 Arab countries specifically mentioned water in their NDCs. The most recent, I think, was Iraq or Bahrain submitted just the other week. It's all there, but it's hard to cost the water bill that we're asking for. What is the need? Again, very easy on adaptation. That comes into what play? Well, we have found at ESCO, we've been using the OECD data sets about how much it costs to pursue work on mitigation and adaptation. And we have found that the trends are that investment flows from MDBs, from international public finance, investment in mitigation increases versus adaptation by 3.5. So for every $3.5 to mitigation, water or adaptation is only getting 1. So the dynamic doesn't make sense, but it's easier to fund easier to fund mitigation, and that's the problem, and therefore we're not costing enough the adaptation side. So to resolve this, we've been working with the UNFCCC, the Arab Climate Negotiators, and of course the League of Arab States to create a strategy that was actually informed to the Arab Arab Ministerial Council for Environment just 10 days ago, to prepare a needs-based climate finance policy and strategy to help mobilize finance into the sectors that are important for this region. And I think we all agree water is one of that key, and at least water-dependent sectors. We're looking forward to advance that. The chair of CAMRI, Her Excellency Yasmina Fouad, actually was quite articulate on her interest about generating this regional strategy for Arab states that is need-based, based on our priorities that can be articulated forward. And at ESQA, as a regional commission and as the host of the Arab Center for Climate Change Policies, we stand ready to continue to support Arab states to move that forward as we go through. And then just in closing, and I know, thank you for prevailing and letting me speak a little bit more than a presentation. I wanted to highlight that what has become increasingly evident when we think of water and finance is that we're facing a double deficit, right? We have the issue of water resource scarcity. So we are a water scarce region, but we're facing also the challenge of financial scarcity. And when we look at that financial scarcity issue, we should not only look at investments which increase the debt for future generations. We should also, as developing countries, have a mechanism to also erase or actually reallocate debt from past, because as we look at bonds, they're very important. There's other instruments that come forward to increase the resources for investment in water and adaptation, but there's so much debt being laden that we also have to think of alternative mechanisms. And I'd like to highlight that ESQA, under the leadership of our executive secretary, has a new climate SDGs debt swap mechanism and donor nexus to help countries reallocate with donor connections resources that are already committed interest payments that are so high. Countries are paying so much interest on their debt, being able to use that for then productive purposes for adaptation. So you're not creating more debt, but using the debt you have for more beneficial purposes. And hopefully, with a lot of innovative tools out there and new strategies, we can move the needle forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. Wow, that's a lot of good ideas in a short time as a reaction to what we hear today. And I'm glad that there are interesting prospects in terms of a strategy for needs-based strategy at the regional level that countries should take up and make use of in their effort to access global climate finance. I'm pleased to have the next discussant, Dr. Aqsa Bahri from Tunisia. She has the privilege of being both, sorry, نفصل؟ لا مش ممكن. Sorry. Dr. Aqsa Bahri is a researcher and a former minister of Agriculture, Water and Fishery in Tunisia. I will be asking Dr. Aqsa a simple question, but a difficult one at the same time. The climate evidence and climate data is available, yet the climate policy are not moving fast. Where are the bottlenecks that prevent science uptake to formulate adequate water policies in the climate documents such as Indices, NAPS and NAMAS? Dr. Aqsa, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm hearing you, Hamu, and I would like to, do you hear me? Hello? Hello, Hamu, do you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank you for the invitation to take part to this session, which is quite important. And so to try to respond to your question, I would like first to start to put the climate issue within the big picture, and referring to the global risk report of the World Economic Forum, where, I mean, among the highest likelihood risks of the next 10 years. So we have extreme weather, climate action failure, and human-led environmental damage, And among the highest impact risks of the next decade, we have infectious diseases, and we know what it means now, which are in the top spot, followed by climate action failure and other environmental risks. So climate, environmental, or health risks are the most likely and the most dangerous of the global risks facing humanity. And so such risks are similar in intensity and probability to the health drama we are experiencing. And at the same time, we have to take into account the growing societal fragmentation manifested through persistent and emerging risks to human health, rising unemployment, widening digital divides, youth disillusionment, and which have also severe consequences. So I want to start with this because, I mean, for me, you'll see how talking about the Tunisian case that is also can be expanded to other Arab states, we'll see that we have to take into account different dimensions. So from the point of view of climate change, Tunisia is considered highly vulnerable, and we are having, I mean, the level of the water in our dams is very low, so we don't know how. Just started raining yesterday, but we don't know how we are going to go through the challenges that we are going to face. So the serious problem of drought. And but when we talk about adverse impact, so when we talk about rising temperature, decreasing precipitation, increasing evapotranspiration, all this is about availability of water resources. And I think the water community has not been very good at making the case for water, and that adaptation is all about water. And the IPCC, the climate people, have been much more organized and have been for a long period of time working very, I mean, in a more, I have to say, structured way in order to make the case for mitigation. But I mean, I think that the water people are talking to water people. It's a large community, but we need also to talk to other people in order to make the case for adaptation, which in our region is really the main problem we are facing, and that we have to understand that adaptation is all about water. Mitigation is about energy, and adaptation is about water. We have not been good at having this message, that, I mean, to share this message and to make it understood. And still, when we look at our NDCs, we are addressing all water is one component among the others, but the interlinkages of water with the other elements, I think we have not been very good at that. And this is why we are seeing battling, and we have not been, as I said, we are still having these sessions where we are dealing with these aspects. So when we, coming back to the NDCs in Tunisia, I mean, we have been, as I said, in Tunisia, very good to developing policies and strategy in favor of environmental protection and climate action. And so we have very good and nice documents that have been produced. And the question that, for example, the NDC have been even, we had submitted one in 2016 and then revised it with more ambitious targets in 2021, increasing even the levels of reduction of emission intensity up to 45, it was 41% by 2030, but increasing it. And so the question is also, the document that we have been produced is really looking at the paradigm shift and intersectoral approach, as I said. But when we look at it, in fact, I mean, these linkages for me have to be more strengthened. We have to have different approach, more systemic approach, where we are looking more in depth to these aspects in order to be able to respond to the challenges that we are facing. So the NDC, the revised one, so we have a prioritized action plan with vertical action that respond to specific sector issues, cross-cutting actions to better understand intersectoral challenges, and that are affecting the 6 most vulnerable sectors. So water is one of them, agriculture, ecosystem, the coastal line, health, and tourism, taking also into account 3 new areas of cross-cutting interventions: gender, land use planning, and natural disaster reduction. So, and there are a number of adaptation options that have been, that have
with inspiring insights from Tunisia and the particular context of Tunisia. We have now the last few words from Dr. Ayman Shazli, a senior negotiator and the chair of the Arab Group of Negotiators, talking to us from the battlefield from Glasgow. Dr. Ayman, we only have 1 minute and a half instead of 7 minutes that were planned for you. Can you tell us in 2 words the role of the current situation in Glasgow? What should we expect as a region that is having the challenge of water scarcity? And how can we think of access to finance opportunities for the Arab region in 1 minute and a half?
Excuse me, Hamu, I have not finished. Did I use all my time? Hello?
Hello, Akisa, we are running out of time, unfortunately, and if you allow me to give 1 minute to the last speaker, because there is a ministerial panel after our session, and there are 7 ministers waiting outside, and the pressure from the organizers to leave the room immediately. So I'm very sorry for that. And I'm calling Dr. Ayman, if you can please make a statement on what should we expect as a region in terms of access to finance for the water sector, and how your experience as a board member of GCC can guide us as countries on what we need to do to make a better access to climate finance for the water sector. Dr. Ayman معنا؟
السلام عليكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. دكتور شكرا لك على الدعوة الكريمة. دكتور حمو، دكتور بشر، الجميع سعيد بوجودي معكم. أعتذر على وجودي بالمنظر هذا لأن توي وصلت إلى غلاسكو، دوبي دخلت الأوتيل، فالمعذرة من الجميع. سعيد بوجودي معكم الحقيقة، والموضوع هام جدا يحتاج وقت طويل، ولكن أعرف إنه باقي دقيقة على الموضوع. اللي بدي أقول إنه عندنا مشكلة كبيرة when it comes to financing for water projects, simply because there is a lot of confusion around water funding, because there is an argument that water projects are developmental projects, they're not climate change projects. And there is always this argument that if we were to finance projects under the GCF for funding for projects that has to do, or projects that have to do with water, are we financing development or we're financing climate projects? And there is this always argument that where is climate rationale when we fund projects that have to do with increasing water production or water desalination or what have you. So we have faced this from the very, very early time when we approved the first set of projects. There was a project for Maldives, there was a project for Fiji, and developed countries came to oppose those projects to say that these are not climate-related projects, these are development projects, and we're not here for that business. So there's always this argument against funding water projects. We all understand that when we talk about adaptation, it is, in many cases, it's about water adaptation, water vulnerability, and water, shortage, and there are issues around that. So our difficulty is that really securing funding for water projects. And as you know, those projects are not economically attractive to the private sector, and therefore, unless we get grants from the public sector, we'll not be able to do it. This is the challenge, and will continue to be the challenge. And until we resolve 2 things. Number 1, define what climate finance is, and also define what do we mean by climate rationale is, we will not be able to secure the right funding for water projects in the Arab region. Let me just leave it there and tell you these are the challenges that we have. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamid.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ayman, for those statements. And with that, we come to the conclusion of this session. There are a lot of good ideas that we could not sum up, but we promise that we will put them in a paper and share it with those of you that are already registered in this session. Thanks to UNESCO, thanks to the panelists, thanks to the audience, and maybe last short sentence.
The important thing is we started the discussion. Let's continue it individually and as organizations.
take تفضل دكتور محمود one sentence one sentence.
So I would like to thank interventions and the insightful presentations. Thank you all. Okay. Thank you. I agree with all your insightful informations and presentations. It appears that we are all agreed that climate change is very crucial for the region to take action, especially for the finance. The climate finance is very important. So actually, I know that the time is very tight. So thank you very much for all of you, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, and thanks to UNESCO and to the panelists and to the audience. And we apologize to the next session organizers for being late. Actually, we took our 90 minutes, but we started late. Thank you.
Thank you.